as the revolutions of 1848 led Europe to start moving in a more politically and economically inclusive direction, which will lead to nationalism in the long run. The Age of Revolution did get to Asia, but not all of Asia. It was one country in particular. And it got to Asia because a U.S. commander, Commodore Matthew Perry, he was a ship captain for the United States Navy, forced Japan to open up. Japan had been economically isolated, just like China had been, and U.S. Navy forced it to open. In 1853, Matthew Perry landed in Japan and forced Japan to open up, and it would lead to a trade agreement between the U.S. and Japan in the following year, in 1854, which would later be expanded to include France, England, the Netherlands, and Russia, due to U.S. pressure. So the United States, it will become a dominant force to enforce globalization, kind of like the British had and the Netherlands had. This was really important for Japan because although it meant the end of its former government, Tokugawa government, it will mean the Meiji Restoration. And this is really important for Japanese history because it's under this new imperial rule that Japan will start industrializing, it'll start urbanizing, and it'll start adopting Western ideas and Western production methods. It will become more politically centralized, like the countries of Europe and the United States. It will become more highly educated. It will create public schools. It'll become more economically advanced and industrialized. And it will become more militaristic. They had a slogan, enrich the country, strengthen the military. Part of the humiliation of the U.S. forcing them to open, Japan will become a more militaristic and nationalistic country. And that will only continue to grow. So the revolutions spread to Asia, but it specifically was targeted at Japan. The Age of Revolutions is generally quite often said to end in 1848, but I don't think that is accurate. I don't think that is a good place to stop. There's one more revolution, and it is a failed revolution. It is a failed independence movement, the Civil War. It's called a civil war because the South lost. Had the South won, it would have been a war of Southern independence. It is a revolutionary movement. It is a war, it is a secession. And obviously, most people are very familiar with it, so just a little bit to say about the causes. Fundamentally, the causes were, this is one of those subjects that a lot of people get wrong. People on the left tend to say it's only about slavery, and people on the far right say it's not about slavery at all, and both are incorrect. The Civil War was about more than just slavery. Slavery was a central part of it, but it's about more than just that. It was the South trying to stop the economic, political, and social changes taking place. The South is trying to avoid the revolutions that are the soft revolutions, the economic revolutions, industrialization, that were taking place. So it will be completely sectional, which is why it was able to happen in the first place. in 2024, I think somewhere around 50% of the U.S. population thinks there will be a civil war. And while no one can say for sure, there definitely won't be a civil war like the one in the past, because there is one really important feature about the one in the past that is not present today, and that is the political or geographic division. So the overall main cause was the issue of slavery, because slavery, it keeps coming up over and over and over and over again. And slavery comes up in every major issue in the 1850s. The Crisis and Compromise of 1850, all the major issues about slavery. Kansas-Nebraska Act, 1854, is about slavery. Anger at the Supreme Court due to the Dred Scott decision was about slavery. And in 1860, Southerners will reject a Democrat because he's a Northern Democrat, Stephen Douglas, and say, we want an all-out pro-slavery Southern Democrat, which is why they will nominate a guy named John Breckinridge. John Breckinridge was an all-out pro-slavery Southerner. So they reject a Northern Democrat because he wasn't pro-slavery enough. He wasn't anti-slavery by any means, but he wasn't pro-slavery enough. And when they do this, they were already going to lose, but of course it ensured they were going to lose, and which of course led to Abraham Lincoln becoming president. Southern states will intentionally divide, Southerners will intentionally divide the Democratic Party. And when they lost, they will secede. So they lost the election, and they will, one by one, start seceding, even before Abraham Lincoln becomes president. Now, if there's any doubt that the Civil War was about slavery, the best place to look to understand the cause was Southern states' Declaration of Secession. So every one of the Southern states, they will declare independence, and they will write their Declaration of Secession, which is the equivalent to the American Declaration of Independence. It is the best and the brightest of every state getting together and formally writing down why they are leaving the Union. And they were not at all subtle about why they were doing it. South Carolina, increasing hostility on the part of non-slaveholding states to the institution of slavery. Election of a man to the high office of President of the United States whose opinions and purposes are hostile to slavery. Now, Lincoln had made it very clear, I'm not going to do anything to slavery. He wasn't going to let it spread, but he wasn't going to attack it. But Southerners were so wound up that his position was too anti-slavery for them. Mississippi, our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world. Texas, the institution known as Negro slavery, the servitude of the African to the white race within her limits. Southern states and their beneficent and patriarchal system of African slavery. So they're very clear about why they are seceding. They were not at all subtle about it. If you went back in time and were living in the 1860s, there is absolutely no way you could convince Southerners this is not about slavery. So they were very, very clear about it. And these are not just like written by a couple of drunks on the back of cocktail napkins. This is the best and the brightest getting together to formally saying why they were seceding. But it wasn't just slavery, though. It was bigger than just slavery. Slavery is a core feature of it, but it's what slavery also represented, because another really important factor about why the Southern states will secede is because they had lost political power. And this is very important to understand, especially because of why the American Revolution started. Slave-owning planters had dominated U.S. politics for most of U.S. history by the time of the Civil War. Once dominant class of slave-owning planters were losing political power, and there's nothing more dangerous than a group that has political power that becomes the political minority, or they are losing political power. They act very desperately. They will do anything to maintain power. And that's what happened in the South. Southerners begin acting increasingly desperate to maintain power. And you see this in everything that happens in the 1850s. California wanted to come into the Union in 1850 as a free state because there are no slaves, and they fought that because it would mean another free state, which means less political power. But there are no slaves in California, so there was no, why would they fight it? It's because they needed to maintain power, and that's also why when the Kansas-Nebraska Act occurred in 1854, without going into the details of it, Southerners were trying to force slavery into areas where there were no slaves. There will be, in a place called Kansas, there will be a miniature civil war called Bloody Kansas, where they will try to force slavery into areas where it doesn't exist because they want to maintain political power. The South's population was so much smaller than that of the North that they will do anything to maintain political power. And it's because of these actions, it's because of the Kansas-Nebraska Act specifically, and what Southerners will do to try to maintain power and try to force the North to accept them having more political power, doing things that are blatantly illegal, and the mini civil war that breaks out in Kansas, that will lead to the creation of the Republican Party. So it's because of Southerners' actions that the Republican Party is created, and really importantly for our purposes, the Republican Party is a purely Northern party. So the Democrats were a party that was national, but the South was solidly Democratic. So there are Democrats in the North, but the South is solidly Democratic. With the creation of the Republican Party, now you had a completely sectional, completely Northern party that was only supporting policies that benefited the North. And now you have what it takes to make a civil war. You have a moral issue of slavery, and you have political division. So Southerners are losing political power, and it was very obvious that they had completely lost political power. So 2 years after the creation of the Republican Party, the election of 1856, Republicans will nominate a guy named John Fremont. Democrats will nominate James Buchanan. Whenever you hear someone say, so-and-so is the worst president in U.S. history, always ask about James Buchanan. He really was one of the worst presidents in U.S. history. Buchanan ends up winning, but what was really important about the election of 1856 is the Republican Party had been around for 2 years, and had they just got 2 more states, Illinois and Pennsylvania, the Republican Party would have won without a single vote from the entire South, which just shows that Southerners had lost all political power. With the creation of the Republican Party, the North had such a big population compared to the South that the South could not win an election if the North was united and had a good candidate. So Southerners in 1856, they warned the North, if you win an election, we are going to leave. So in the context of what we talked about with the American Revolution, the Southern position does make more sense, not justifying what they did, but they had lost political power. Just like in the American Revolution, when political power was the issue, the South had lost political power. And so because they lost political power, again, they act increasingly desperate to maintain it at all costs, no matter what, which is the only way to understand how irrational some of their behavior is, like splitting the party in 1860. So there is a very obvious political consideration, but there's also an economic consideration. Southerners opposed a lot of issues that benefited the North, like the tariff, having a transcontinental railroad run through the North, and there was a lot of economic issues. Those are two big ones. Also something called the Homestead Act. It was going to get more people to move out to and start farming in the Midwest. Homestead Act meant if you lived somewhere, if you lived on a piece of land and you worked it and improved it for 5 years, you get it for free. Southerners opposed that because it was going to mean more people moving to the North for that free land, which is going to mean less power for them. So there's economic considerations, but the most important one is cotton. The only way to understand the American Revolution and to understand what Southerners did and how desperate they were is understanding that cotton is the most important natural resource in the world until the Civil War. For decades, cotton from the United States South is the single most important natural resource. That's why they truly believed they were going to make a new nation. They were going to declare independence, create a new country based on cotton. The South, safely entrenched behind her cotton bags, can defy the world, for the civilized world depends on the cotton of the South. No power on earth dares to make war upon it. Cotton is king. And you just look at the numbers and you can kind of understand where they were coming from. By 1860, on the eve of the Civil War, almost 60% of all U.S. exports is cotton. It's the most highly demanded natural resource. It is the equivalent of oil. So a good way to think about this is, what would someone, what do people do to control oil? Pretty much anything. It means that you're going to be insanely wealthy if you control it. So think of King Cotton, think of the South's view on cotton like OPEC today, or the countries that control oil, or the way oil is viewed today. That is how cotton was viewed. Now, the only way to pick cotton was, cotton required slaves to be picked in order to be profitable. So slavery obviously was a crucial factor, but slavery is because of cotton. Cotton is what was really in demand. So there's an economic consideration. And the South, they truly believed they were going to create a nation based on that one natural resource. But again, it's the same as all the countries that exist because they have a lot of oil and whose economy is totally based on oil. So that is the South's logic, is slavery was a major issue. Slavery was because of cotton, but there's also political consideration. So Southerners, they will insist that they represented the will of the Founding Fathers. They were heirs to the Founding Fathers. And they're not completely wrong. Again, this isn't justifying their position. It's just to understand their position. They're not completely wrong. They're wanting the country to stay an agricultural nation dominated by planters, which it had been since the beginning. The Republicans, they are the ones that are calling for policies that were going to change the nation from a predominantly agricultural nation to an industrialized nation. It was going to change the country fundamentally. And so when Southerners said they are heirs to the founders, they can make it with some justification. They can say that statement with some justification. Doesn't mean they're right, but they are trying to bring America back to what the founders had created. And so their biggest claim to that, though, is that they had lost political power. And that is very similar to the reasons for the American Revolution. So the South will try to rebel and, of course, will fail. But the Civil War is important for our purposes for several reasons. A couple are specific to the United States, but for the bigger picture, for the world, there are some very important legacies of the Civil War. In the United States, as we all know, the Civil War ended slavery. Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which guaranteed that slavery would end. And then, after the Civil War, the 13th Amendment was passed. So it ended slavery. Or did it? There is one exception. So slavery actually is allowed in the United States with one single exception. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted. So the one exception in the United States to the prohibition of slavery is criminals. You ever wondered, why does the United States have more criminals than anywhere else in the world? Why do we put more people in jail in this country than anywhere else in the world? There you go. It's because of the one exception in the 13th Amendment. That is why the United States has about 4% of the world's population, 4.2%, 332 million people in this country, and at least for a while it had about 25% of all prisoners in the world in this one country. And it's because that one exception in the 13th Amendment. So it wasn't anti-slavery with one major notable exception. Another legacy of the Civil War in the United States is the preservation of democracy. This may not seem like a huge deal, but the whole Civil War started because Southerners rejected the outcome of a fair election that they just legitimately lost. Now, in most places in the world, if there is a civil war that is threatening to destroy the country, whoever's in charge would very often say, all right, we're not going to have an election. We are in the middle of a crisis. Our country's about to fail or fall apart. And so I'm canceling this election and I'm staying in power. There were some people that recommended that to Lincoln. Lincoln never once considered it. Lincoln never once considered it because he believed so fully and so completely in the United States and its fundamental feature, democratic government, or representative democracy. He had been born insanely poor, and only in the United States could someone have been born as poor as him, in as terrible a situation, and rise up to be president of the United States. And so he never once considered not having an election because the democratic form of government that has existed from the beginning of the nation is so fundamental to the country. So he will run again, and he actually thought he was going to lose. He was so sure he was going to lose. He ran against one of his former military generals, a guy named George McClellan. He was so sure he was going to lose that he actually wrote his letter accepting his loss. A lot of people thought he was going to lose. Obviously, he ended up winning, but just the fact that he held an election meant that democracy itself is fundamentally important, and preserved the Union, preserved the Republic. Something that I find absolutely amazing. Lincoln won, but he only got 55% of the votes. So Southerners, obviously, they didn't vote because they were not part of the Union. They didn't want to vote. It's not that they didn't have the right to vote. If they joined back in the Union, Lincoln would have been incredibly happy to let them vote. So they had taken themselves out of the voting, so they weren't involved. But even in the North, 45% of the population thought, no, Lincoln's doing a terrible job. That is American politics, just so you know. Every election, it is about 80 to 90% of the population already know how they're going to vote, and they're going to vote that way no matter what. So it's always a very small part of the population. But preservation of the Union in the United States was a fundamentally important part of the legacy of the Civil War. Another political legacy is, with this election, we get, it's called the Republican era. Up until the Civil War, Southern planters dominated U.S. politics. From the beginning of the country to 1861, it's about 70 years, slaveholders had been president for about 50 years. So 50 of the 70 years, slave owners had controlled the government. After the Civil War, Republicans will control the government, or will control the presidency for every election save two. It's Grover Cleveland and Woodrow Wilson. So this will mean an end to Southern dominance in U.S. politics. So the United States political system will fundamentally change. And when that happens, the United States will move away from the country of Jefferson and Jackson, and it will move to the country of Hamilton. There's also this is also for the United States will usher in the period of nationalism. Now, it's not that Americans all agreed with each other. It's not that there weren't still political divisions, but the United States became one unified nation. In history, there is something called digital history. You can actually study the usage of words and phrases in newspapers and written text and stuff like that. And before the Civil War, Americans used the term, the United States are. And after the Civil War, they will start saying the United States is. So there was a general view that the United States is one unified nation, which is really important for the period of nationalism. This will also lead to the North being able to pass the economic policies that will launch it to become the world economic superpower. An economic effect of the Civil War is the U.S. will start passing the acts and the laws that Hamilton had called for a long time ago, and that will propel the United States to become the economic superpower of the world. So the South taking themselves out of the nation allowed the North, allowed the Republicans to pass the policies that will launch the United States to become the economic superpower within just a few decades, in a very short period of time after the Civil War and due to the Civil War. Because during the Civil War, the North will develop manufacturing in order to mass produce weapons, guns, stuff like that. The United States will and leave the agrarian past, the one Jefferson and Jackson had wanted, and the policies they had enacted that prevented the United States from advancing, and will accept Hamilton's view and become the economic world power. And finally, militarily, Civil War is the most deadly war in U.S. history. The numbers are, the graph says 620,000 dead. The Best estimates today, I believe, are 750,000. When I started graduate school, it was like it was 600,000, I think it was. So the numbers keep going up. When you are dealing with that many people, whether you're talking about wars or plagues, the numbers are always underestimated. And so the numbers will always increase over time. Militarily, it is the deadliest war in U.S. history, obviously. Now, the French had the first total war where they conscripted all of society and they got society excited about the war, involved in the war, and all of society was geared toward the war. Americans, the United States, the Civil War will be the first mass production industrialized war. And it is why the U.S. will develop manufacturing and become the manufacturing power. But these three things that I just mentioned, nationalism, industrialization, and industrial war, will be dominant in the next phase of world history. The era of nationalism, era of industrialization, nationalism, and World War I and World War II.